Hey guys, Sean here. Welcome to the F1 Word and to a roundup, debrief, rundown, whatever you want to call it, of some of the big talking points from the Bahrain Grand Prix, and what a race it was. There was so much action up and down the field and plenty to get excited for this coming season, and you know what? I know it's only one race, but it looks like we might just have a title fight on our hands in 2021. It's about time. But anyway, let's start by having a quick look at the final race result. Lewis Hamilton kicked off the new season with victory, just finishing ahead of Max Verstappen for Red Bull, with Valtteri Bottas finishing third in the second Mercedes. Lando Norris was fourth for McLaren, with Sergio Perez recovering to fifth in the second Red Bull, and Charles Leclerc, good weekend for him, sixth place in the end. Daniel Ricciardo, seventh for McLaren on his debut for the team. Sainz as well on his debut for Ferrari was eighth place. Yuki Tsunoda, rookie of the day by a mile, 9th place for him, 10th place for Lance Stroll for Aston Martin, taking that final point. And then we've got Kimi Raikkonen in 11th place, just ahead of teammate Giovinazzi, with Esteban Ocon 13th for Alpine, George Russell 14th, and Sebastian Vettel down in 15th in the second Aston. Mick Schumacher did make it to the end for Haas on his debut, 16th place for him, and then DNFs, technically speaking, were Gasly and Latifi, but also Alonso and Mazepin. Now, shortly, I will run through every team and driver with a few words on their weekends and what they've had to say post-Bahrain. But first of all, we've got to go over the major talking point from yesterday's race, and that was, of course, track limits again. In case you missed it, there was some major controversy up at Turn 4 as drivers were running beyond what was considered to be the edge of the track, with Hamilton seen to be doing it apparently for much of the first half of the race. And then, with a few laps to go, Max Verstappen went for a move around the outside of the Brit at that corner, but completed the move by going off the track, and was therefore asked to return the position, which in the end he did. As you might imagine, this has caused quite a stir, especially over on social media, with many asking why it was okay for Hamilton to be gaining an advantage at that corner throughout the first part of the race, but it wasn't okay for Verstappen to keep that position. As usual, all the fuss that has been kicked up comes down to the same thing we've been talking about on this channel for years, and that is FIA inconsistency. Before I get to that though, and first of all, that move from Verstappen was illegal and is covered by a completely different rule to the breaching track limits rule we see implemented in qualifying, for example. And both Red Bull and Max Verstappen seem very accepting of the fact that that position had to be given back. So essentially, any driver who makes an overtake or completes a move by having all four wheels outside of the predefined track limits must return the position or face a penalty. Now yes, from some angles Verstappen does appear to be ahead going through the corner, from other angles it's not quite so clear, but he was carrying a fair bit of speed into that corner and he did complete the move by going off the track. It really is as simple as that with that regulation. I've seen some arguments saying Hamilton pushed him off, and others saying he had a snap of oversteer which he had to correct and therefore that's why he went wide. But if that is the case, it's unfortunate, but the move was still completed off track and therefore is still considered illegal. The second issue though, and you could argue the bigger issue, is track limits themselves. And this is where we find all of these grey areas we keep talking about. Now on Friday, Michael Massey made changes to the race director's event notes that said, the track limits at the exit of Turn 4 will not be monitored with regard to setting a lap time, as the defining limits are the artificial grass and the gravel trap in that location. That is in reference to the race, how they're going to police it in the race. So basically, they're not going to bother. Although that line did not apply to qualifying, where if a driver left the track at Turn 4, they would have their lap time deleted. And post-race, Massey explained that drivers were told that track limits would not be monitored when it comes to setting a lap time in the race. However, it would be monitored as per the sporting regulations to ensure that a lasting advantage was not gained. And clarifying Verstappen's move, Massey added, what was mentioned and discussed with the drivers at the drivers' meeting is that if an overtake takes place with the car off track and gains a lasting advantage, I will go on the radio and suggest to the team that they immediately relinquish that position. And that was made very clear. Red Bull were actually given an instruction immediately by myself. I suggested that they relinquish that position as listed in the sporting regulations, which they did. It wasn't for exceeding the track limits, it was for gaining a lasting advantage by overtaking another car off the racetrack. It is also worth noting that although it appeared as though the rules or the way they were being monitored and implemented changed mid-race, Massey is absolutely adamant that was not the case and reiterated his point about race lap times and gaining a lasting advantage. and went on to add that Hamilton running wide and Verstappen's off-track overtake were, quote, very clearly specifically different. I'm just going to sit here and let you make your own minds up on that one, but to say it's legal for drivers to leave the track at turn 4 but then issue an instruction mid-race for drivers not to leave the track at turn 4, something doesn't quite add up there. And this is the grey area, isn't it? What is considered a lasting advantage? Sure, it's easy to call when you see an overtake made or completed outside of the defined limits, but what about lap time? Lewis Hamilton won that race by just over 0.7 of a second. Now, Christian Horner and a number of people far more knowledgeable on these things than I am think the advantage was anywhere from 1/10 or 2/10 per lap. If, as footage appears to show, Hamilton did cross that line on almost 30 occasions, that's a lot more than 7.5 of a second come the end of the race. Yet, by the definition of the regulations, that's not considered a lasting advantage. And for the record, I'm not having a go at Hamilton at all with this one. He was following the rules that were laid out pre-race by the race director, which basically say it's fine so long as you don't gain a lasting advantage. Again, the notes were focusing on overtaking and not lap time, and so he wasn't in any breach of any rules. And don't forget, he did stop using that line once the instruction came from the stewards to do so. My issue with this is not Hamilton, it's not Verstappen, it's no other driver, it is 100% with the stewards again. How about, it's just a thought, and maybe this is far too much common sense for Formula One, but rather than having these stupid grey areas, the FIA sit down and come up with a hard black and white rule similar to what we see in other series like MotoGP, for example. So if a driver exceeds track limits, let's say 5 times, they get a black and white flag. If they do it a 6th time, it's a 5-second penalty, no arguments. That's the rule, and that rule stays the same and doesn't get changed just because drivers are having a moan. Because at the end of the day, as was proven once again this weekend, this time by Lewis Hamilton, as soon as a driver who has been running wide at those corners for most of the race is told to stop doing it, because if they don't, they're going to face a penalty, lo and behold, they suddenly have the ability to keep it within the track limits. Ultimately, as Martin Brundle always says, if there wasn't an advantage to gain, the drivers wouldn't be out there. And actually, for what it's worth, I don't think having to hand that place back to Hamilton was what cost Verstappen the win yesterday. Personally, I believe Red Bull's decision not to react to Hamilton's first stop is what cost him the win in the end. Super quickly, since recording that ranty thing that I just did there, I wanted to let you know that Sam Collins has put together a really good thread on Twitter explaining the track limits issue in some really good detail, including screenshots on several incidents. And by the way, FOM seem to get very annoyed when I use screenshots, hence the lack of them in this video, unfortunately. So I'll link that Twitter thread in the description and the comments for anybody that wants to go and check that out. There are a couple of other things I want to mention whilst we're on Mercedes and Red Bull and before I go through everyone else. First of all, track limits aside, it was a really strong drive from Hamilton to fend off Verstappen, and Mercedes made some great strategy calls. Triggering the undercut was a smart move, and as I've already said, I believe ultimately won Hamilton the race. I genuinely still can't quite get my head around why Red Bull didn't react more quickly, although it must be said Verstappen does say that they didn't react because they were sticking to their own strategies. It was, quote, working fine. Still though, you've got to react to what's going on around you, so a bit of an odd one there, and actually a great example of how important it is that Sergio Perez gets himself in the mix with the top 3 to give Red Bull the chance to, I suppose dictate strategy rather than letting Mercedes dictate it. And on strategy, Valtteri Bottas was pretty fed up post-race, and the Finn was unhappy as he felt the team was being too passive. Is this the new Valtteri Bottas? And wanted to see a more aggressive approach, adding that he wanted to go long on his second stint, which to be honest is what I thought Merck were going to do when they left him out. In fact, he was actually told over team radio, wasn't he, that he was going to go long, only for the team to pit him a couple of laps later. It's a weird one. So I can completely understand his frustration with that decision. He did pit late on for fresh tyres, so he could grab that point for fastest lap, but that'll be very little consolation for him. Of course, his race was hampered by a slow pit stop as well, which saw him stationary for over 10 seconds. It's just another one of those days for Bottas, wasn't it? But as I'll probably say a lot shortly, it's a long season and grabbing an early 16 points is a very good start. And Sergio Perez, what a rollercoaster weekend for him. Checo failed to make Q3 on Saturday and started P11 only for his car to lose power and stop on the formation lap. It looked like it was game over. But to quote Checo, "This thing woke up and I turned on the engine and I had to start from the pit lane." I love the way he says this thing woke up. I'm sure there's something more technical behind that, but it was great to see him get going again for his first race with Red Bull. He made an early stop under the safety car and drove brilliantly to recover to finish P5. So I think he can be very happy with his race in the end. Of course, he'd like to have started higher up the grid, but it was a very good recovery. and it was great to see him able to fight back like that in a car he's barely driven, really. So a good start from Checo. Right then, let's fly through the rest of the field, starting at McLaren. I think the team can be very happy with the weekend as a whole, although I must admit I expected more in quali from them. That said, points are handed out on a Sunday and they picked up a hatful. Lando Norris was superb, frankly, yesterday, and that 4th place, even with Checo charging through the field, never really looked in any doubt. Lando said post-race that he was happy overall and pleased to see the car was good enough to fight those around him on pure pace. There was a moment at turn 4 where he went wheel to wheel with, I'm sure it was Charles Leclerc. I've had a look for it, but I can't find it. Let me know if it was anybody else, but I'm positive it was Leclerc. And he said over the radio he had been squeezed off, but then said later after the race that it was just hard racing and he'd have done exactly the same. Daniel Ricciardo, I think anyway, had a solid start to life at McLaren after all. 7th place and points on the board is a good debut, especially given that he won't be up to speed just yet. Definitely still more to come from the Aussie. Funnily enough though, Ricciardo says he wasn't happy with his race, adding that he couldn't find the pace when he needed to, but is now focused on going over the data, learning from his first weekend, and looking at the positives. But a solid start for McLaren. As for Ferrari, it was also a solid start to the season, and perhaps a better one than many were expecting. Charles Leclerc's lap in quali was, for me at least, possibly the lap of the day, and he drove exceptionally well to take P6 on race day. That said, he's another one who wasn't totally satisfied with the result and isn't, I suppose, unsurprisingly, where he wants to ultimately be. Leclerc felt there was a bit more in the tyres towards the end of his first stint and so could have probably carried on a little bit longer, but agreed with the team's call to pit earlier to try to force others onto a different strategy. However, that ultimately cost them towards the end when it came to pace, according to Leclerc. Carlos Sainz described his first race as solid, and I tend to agree, to be honest. It's tough for any driver at a new team to get straight up to speed, but grabbing P8 and showing some good pace is a really good start for the Spaniard. But kind of in the same way as Daniel Ricciardo, he is very much focused on getting up to speed and learning from his first weekend in that car. But I think there are a lot of positives to take away from this weekend for Sainz. It was a mixed bag for AlphaTauri in Bahrain. Whilst the team did pick up a couple of points, to be fair, it could have been so much more, and I think they'll look at Sunday as a bit of a missed opportunity. Pierre Gasly was another one who delivered a fantastic lap in qualifying to end up P5, but contact with Daniel Ricciardo early on in the race saw the Frenchman lose his front wing, and that was pretty much that, really. The car did also suffer damage to the floor, which left Gasly struggling for pace and ultimately retiring towards the end of the race. Understandably, Pierre was very disappointed and is another one focused on bouncing back in time for Imola. As for his teammate though, well, what a debut for Yuki Tsunoda. He looked quick all weekend and perhaps should have made it into Q3 on Saturday on pure pace. But that doesn't matter. He drove brilliantly on Sunday and made some seriously impressive overtakes, most notably on Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. Considering he's a rookie, nothing seemed to faze him. And by the way, Tsunoda described the overtake on Alonso as, quote, quite an emotional experience and pretty exciting. He was disappointed to have lost a few positions at the start, but personally I think he can be very proud of his first F1 weekend. Aston Martin were, for me at least, one of the biggest surprises of the weekend, and not in a good way. The pace just does not seem to be there, and it looks as though they are another team struggling with the tweaks to the 2021 regulations. I mean, Lance Stroll did okay though and was involved in some really good scraps in the field, and at the end of the day at least he walked away with a point. The Canadian said he felt comfortable in the car, but singled out the second half of the race where he was running the hard tyres to the point the race tailed off for him. But point or not, there's a lot of work to do down at Aston. On the other side of the garage, it was a miserable weekend for Sebastian Vettel. He qualified P18, but after failing to abandon his lap as a result of double-waved yellows, he was penalised prior to the Grand Prix and dropped to last place on the grid. He did make a good start though, but ultimately struggled to make the one-stop strategy work, his pace falling off dramatically at the end of the first stint. He does also mention picking up a flat spot, which may have been one of the reasons why he struggled to make that strategy work, but it was the collision with Ocon that wrapped up a thoroughly miserable weekend for him. Now, over team radio, Vettel did initially blame the Frenchman for the incident. It wasn't Ocon's fault at all, by the way, but Seb has since apologised and taken responsibility for the collision. At Alfa Romeo, there has clearly been some progress, certainly more than I was expecting from them. Sure, they didn't pick up any points, but they showed good pace and seemed to be right in the fight with some of those... Are we still calling them midfield teams? I will do for the sake of this video, but they seem to be right in the fight with some of them. Kimi Räikkönen was, perhaps as you'd expect, disappointed to miss out on points and was actually only a couple of seconds behind Stroll come the end of the race. But it was great to see Kimi being able to fight with some of those around him on Sunday, and he's confident that had there been a few more laps, he would have been right on the back of the cars ahead. Antonio Giovinazzi was also up there with Kimi, but unfortunately he lost time due to a slow pit stop, so he could have been even closer to his teammate come the end, but he's happy with his race and felt that he was able to extract everything he could out of that car. Again, I was really surprised and impressed to see Alfa in the mix at the weekend. Alpine came away from Bahrain disappointed with the result, but they actually performed better on race day than I was expecting anyway, based on what we'd seen in practice and qualifying. Fernando Alonso was right up there and fighting hard in the top 10 early doors, and maybe it's just me, but it was genuinely great to see him back and going wheel to wheel again in Formula One. That aside though, the Spaniard retired from the race having lost the rear brakes, and further investigation later revealed that basically he'd been Sirotkined after a sandwich wrap paper got stuck in his brake duct, causing high temperatures and damage to the braking system. The team also said that after Alonso's first pit stop, they discovered, quote, a small issue that forced us to reduce the performance of the car. Esteban Ocon says in a press release that he enjoyed his battles on track on Sunday. However, he states it wasn't the results he wanted, although he feels there are a lot of positives to take away from the weekend. He also confirms, by the way, that Vettel did apologise for the collision between the two of them, but ultimately the team came up short in Bahrain. I must say, though, there is definitely some better race pace in that car, but there is still clearly work to do. Williams were another team who had a bit of a mixed bag of a race, but it was nice to see that they weren't the slowest out there, and they seemed to be more competitive than we've seen in recent years. George Russell made it into Q2 again on Saturday, so a great start to the weekend, and he was able to get involved in some battling early in the race, and Russell described his race as, quote, well executed. I like that, and was happy with the relative pace of the car. Nicholas Latifi said he was pleasantly surprised by the way the car was handling and its overall drivability, which is great to hear. However, unfortunately, Latifi was forced to retire after the team found a suspected boost leak in the power unit, which of course was ultimately costing him power, and it was an issue he says he had felt from the first few laps of the race. Some good steps for Williams though, by the look of it. And finally, for the rundown, it's Haas. As expected, they were very much the slowest out there and struggled to match those immediately ahead. Mick Schumacher spun early on at turn 4, but was able to rejoin safely and continue. However, Mick says he was 90% happy with the weekend, with the other 10 being disappointment at his error. Still though, it was good experience for him in his first race, and at least he was able to make it to the end of the race. Not something that could be said for his teammate though. Nikita Mazepin said he was trying to avoid Schumacher and then got on the power too much, and that caused him to lose the car and spit into the wall, which was what brought out the early safety car. It was a sloppy weekend, to be fair, all round for Mazepin, having spun a couple of times in practice, but there's a lot to learn for the team as a whole. Not a great start to what could be a very long season for Haas. Before I go, and for what it's worth, let's have a very quick look at the championship tables. Of course, the top 10 in the driver standings reflecting the top 10 in the race. Really, the only thing worth mentioning there is that Valtteri Bottas got that point for fastest lap, meaning he's got 16 points rather than just 15 for finishing third. But really, very early days this season, it's kind of pointless looking at this one. So let's move on to the Constructors' Championship. And it's a very familiar sight with Mercedes on top with 41 points, Red Bull in second on 28. And then we've got McLaren third on 18. Ferrari have got 12 in fourth place, with AlphaTauri on 2 and Aston Martin on 1 point in sixth. And then, of course, separated by race finishing position, we've got Alfa Romeo, Alpine, Williams and Haas. That is it for this one, though, and I cannot believe we've got to wait 3 weeks until Imola. Wholly unacceptable. But anyway, I will be back soon with some more content as always. But in the meantime, if you did enjoy this video, then please do leave a like, as it really helps out the channel. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future uploads. But as ever, thank you for watching. I've been Sean, this has been the F1 Word, and until next time, goodbye.